He was the cowboy everyone watched. She was the reason he performed. The first thing I remember about being famous is the quiet before it. Not the quiet after, I know that one too, know it well enough now that I could draw a map of it, every corner, every draft coming under the door. But the quiet before. The way a saloon would still when I walked in. Not stop still, like a held breath. Like the air itself was waiting to see what I'd do. I was 23 the first time it happened. Rode into a town called Corta Piedra, New Mexico territory, with $40 in my pocket and a name that had traveled faster than my horse. Didn't know it yet. Stepped through the door and every head swung to me the way sunflowers track the sun, and I thought something was wrong. Thought I had blood on my shirt, or somebody died behind me on the road. Then the barkeep said my name. Said it like he was saying the name of a river or a mountain. Something that was just there, had always been there, and he was grateful to finally see it in person. I smiled, bought a round, played the part without knowing I was playing it. That was the first day of the rest of my life, and I didn't feel a thing. You want to know what it does to a man, being watched that long. Not the watching you can see, the eyes across a street, the kid who slides close at a campfire trying to hear the real stories, the way bartenders set down your glass a little gentler than anyone else's. That kind you get used to. That kind you learn to wear like a coat. It's the watching you can't see that gets into you. Town you've never been to, you ride in at dusk. By morning, somebody's told somebody else what you had for supper and what your horse's name is. The story of something you did 3 years back in a different territory is told with details nobody witnessed, details that didn't happen, details that are better than what actually happened. And you start to wonder, and this is the part that'll rot you from the inside if you let it, you start to wonder which version is true. You ever done a thing so many times that you can't remember the first time anymore? Can't remember what it felt like before it was just something you did? That's what being a legend does. Eats your past, leaves you with the story instead of the memory. I had killed men, that's the truth of it. I won't dress it up. Killed men in situations that were not of my choosing, in moments that lasted maybe 3 seconds and that I have replayed more times than I've slept. But the story the territory told was bigger. The story was a man who couldn't be touched, who moved through violence like smoke, who had chosen this life from some place of power and purpose. The truth was more like falling down a hill. You don't choose the legend. The legend chooses you, and then you spend the rest of your life trying not to disappoint it. I had a wife once. Her name was Candelita, and I am not going to tell you much about her because she is not this story, and also because some things I have kept for 30 years, and I mean to keep them the rest of the way. What I will tell you is that she was Tejana, from a family that had been on that land since before there was a Texas to be in, and she was proud and sharp, and she laughed at me in a way that kept me honest. She died of a fever in the winter of 1861, 6 months after we married, before she ever knew she was carrying our child. I buried her in cold ground on a Thursday, and by the following Tuesday I was riding north, and by the following month I had done the first thing that got me a reputation, which was to stop a robbery in an Abilene freight office by walking in during the middle of it, and suggesting, at gunpoint, that the 3 men doing the robbing might want to consider a different line of work. They didn't take the suggestion. I shot 2 of them, the 3rd ran. By the following week the story was 5 men. By the following month it was 8, and one of them was somebody famous, which he wasn't. That was how it started. Grief moving north in a dead woman's husband, walking into a room without caring what happened next. That's the seed of every legend I ever heard of when you get down to it. Not courage. Not gift, just a man who had lost the thing that scared him. 15 years of that. 15 years of the name going before me like a scout. 15 years of being the story in the room before I was the man. Towns I'd never seen that knew my face from a dime novel drawing that didn't look like me. A judge once asked me to sign a copy. I signed it with a name that wasn't mine, and he thanked me. By the time I was 38, I had been shot 4 times, stabbed twice, and wanted in 3 territories for things I mostly did, and 1 or 2 I didn't. I had a horse named Duncan who was the best horse I have ever known, and who died of a snake bite in Arizona, and whose death I mourned more sincerely than I have mourned most people. I had enough money hidden in enough places that I could have settled somewhere and lived quietly, except that I had forgotten how to be quiet. That's the honest truth of it, I had forgotten. You stop knowing who you are when nobody ever lets you be anybody else. Every room I walked into, I was walking in as the story. Got so I couldn't remember what I thought about before I had a reputation to maintain. Couldn't sit at a fire without arranging myself in a way that looked right. Couldn't tell a story without half an eye on how it was landing. There was a kid named Carl Westover who rode with me for a while out of Uvalde, 18 years old, more scared than he let on, who thought I was the truest thing he'd ever seen. Wanted to learn from me. Wanted to be me. I let him ride along because the alternative was telling him the truth, which was that there was nothing to learn, that I was mostly luck and grief and keeping still until the moment passed. He got shot in a county dispute that had nothing to do with either of us, and I got him to a doctor who saved him, and the last thing he said to me before I rode on was that he hoped someday he'd be half the man I was. I rode for 3 miles before I stopped and put my forehead against Duncan's neck and stood there a long time. Because I didn't know who I was, and I hadn't for years, and the boy almost died being the shadow of a story I'd never chosen to tell. I'm going to tell you about Rosalind Keel the way I actually remember it, not the way it sounds better. Which means I have to tell you I was not at my best. I was 41 years old, winter of 1878, and I was in Tascosa, Texas, which is a town on the Canadian River in the Panhandle that smells like cattle and cold, and the particular flatness of plains wind that has come a very long way to get where it's going. I was there because I was hiding, which is something the legend was not supposed to do, and which I was doing anyway. There was a man named Price Haverford who wanted to kill me. Not for any dramatic reason. He had some money that used to be his and was now mine, the result of a card game where he cheated badly and I cheated better, and he had decided this was a killing matter. He had hired 2 men to help him decide it. I had been moving for 6 weeks, which was longer than I usually needed to move, because Haverford was more organized than I usually encountered, and because I was tired. Tired in a way that sleep didn't touch. I'd been in Tascosa 4 days. Was staying at a place called the Alameda Hotel, which was really a boarding house with a sign out front that said hotel because the owner, a Mrs. Parr, believed in aspiration. She cooked a good breakfast. The other boarders were a surveyor, a man who bought hides, and a schoolteacher who was new to town, and who I had barely registered except as a shape at the far end of the table who had red hair and asked Mrs. Parr polite questions about the town. On the 5th day, I got careless. Went for a walk after dark, which I knew better than to do and did anyway, because 41 years is a long time to be careful, and sometimes you just want to stand outside and breathe without thinking about angles. I went down to the river, stood there looking at the dark water moving under the last of the light. Price Haverford's 2 men found me there. Now, here is the part where the legend says the famous man turned and shot them both down before either could draw, displaying the supernatural calm and speed for which he was known. Here is what actually happened. One of them hit me from behind with something. I don't know what, I never found out. I went down on the riverbank with my cheek in the mud and the world tilting sideways, and by the time I got my hand on my gun, the second man had his boot on my wrist. And then there was a voice. A woman's voice, which was the last thing either of us expected, coming from the bank above where the trail came down to the river. Clear and even and carrying a tone of mild annoyance, like a woman who has found someone tracking mud across a floor she just cleaned. She said, "I need one of you to help me with something." Both men looked up. People do this. It's the unexpectedness of it, a woman's voice in the dark at the river, speaking with complete calm in the middle of a situation that was clearly not calm. Both of them looked up. I shot the one with his boot on my wrist in the leg. He went down. The second one turned back, and I had already gotten to one knee, and he made a calculation about those odds and decided against them and ran. The one I'd shot was not going to die from it, but was going to remember the evening. I stayed on one knee in the mud for a moment. Then I looked up at the bank. The schoolteacher was standing there with a lantern in one hand and what appeared to be a jar of flour in the other, because Mrs. Parr had apparently sent her to borrow some from a neighbor and she had it with her. The lantern light caught her hair. She was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not afraid, not excited, not what most people looked like when they'd just seen something like that. Something closer to assessing. She said, "Can you walk?" I said I thought so. She said, "Then let's not stand here." Her name was Rosalind Keel. She was 29 years old, from Ohio originally, but she'd been in the territory 3 years, teaching first in Santa Fe and then in a town called Mora and now in Tascosa. because she had the kind of character that moved toward hard places rather than away from them. She had grown up in a family of 9 children, been the third oldest, and had the specific competence of someone who has spent their whole life being needed and has decided to be good at it rather than bitter. I didn't learn most of that right away. What I learned right away was that she helped me back up the bank and up the street to the Alameda Hotel and up the stairs to my room without asking me a single question about what had just happened. And once I was sitting on the bed, she looked at the back of my head in the lamplight and said that I was going to need that cleaned out and that I should sit still. She cleaned it out. She was matter-of-fact about it in the way of someone who has dealt with worse. Then she sat down in the chair across from me and looked at me directly and said, "You're him." I said, "Depends who you mean." She said the name, my name, the one from the dime novels. I said, "That's what they tell me." She looked at me a moment, not the way most people looked, not thrilled, not scared, not calculating. Just looking, like she was reading something and wanted to make sure she had it right. She said, "You don't look like the picture." I said, "Nobody ever does." She said, "The picture makes you look pleased with yourself." I almost laughed. I think I smiled. I said that I had been once. She stood up and gathered the cloth she'd used to clean the cut and the basin of water, because she was tidy, and she stopped at the door and said that Price Haverford was known in this town, that he'd been through twice and both times had left someone worse off, and that I should probably leave before he came himself. I said, "Probably." She said, "Good night then." And she left. I sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight for a long time after that. The cut at the back of my head throbbed. The mud from the riverbank was drying on my coat, and I was thinking without quite knowing why about the thing she'd said. The picture makes you look pleased with yourself. Not afraid, not reverent, just observing. Like I was just a man who was sitting on a bed with a cut on his head, and that was the only thing she was seeing. I didn't leave the next morning. I told myself it was because of the head. Told myself it would be stupid to ride hard with a knock like that I needed a day's rest, and then I'd be off. I sat at the breakfast table, and the schoolteacher sat at the other end, and we said good morning and not much else. And after breakfast, I sat on the porch and watched the street and thought about where Haverford might be. Mrs. Parr came out and sat beside me, which she did sometimes. She was a talker, and the boarders were her audience. She talked about the town, who had land and who owed money on it, who the new doctor was and whether he was any good. She talked about the schoolteacher, who she was fond of, who she said was smarter than anybody in town gave her credit for, who had turned down 2 proposals since arriving in Tascosa because she said she wasn't willing to stop being herself for anybody. I said that seemed reasonable. Mrs. Parr said, "She nursed half the town through the grip last March, didn't sleep 3 days straight. Asked for nothing." She was quiet a minute, then she said, "Some people just came built that way." That afternoon, I saw Rosalind Keel crossing the street with an armload of books, in a wind that was doing its best to knock her sideways, and she was walking straight into it with her chin up, not fighting it, just going. I watched her go until she turned a corner. Then I looked at my hands on my knees, looked at them a long time. These hands, the hands from the dime novel, the hands that were supposed to be the tools of the legend. I thought, when did I last do anything real? I stayed a week. Told myself different things about why, different things each day, each one less convincing than the last. The head needed healing. Haverford's men needed time to clear out. The weather was poor for traveling. Duncan needed rest, though I hadn't brought Duncan, hadn't had a horse since Arizona, had been moving on rented animals and stage lines. The truth was simpler, and I didn't want to look at it. We ate at the same table 3 times a day. Suppers were the longest. Mrs. Parr liked supper to be a proper occasion, expected conversation. The surveyor talked about land. The hide buyer talked about prices. Rosalind Keel talked about her students, about what the younger ones were learning and what the older ones were fighting against learning, and once about a boy of about 12 who she thought was the brightest student she'd ever had, and who was being pulled by his father into ranch work before he'd had a chance to find out what else he might be. I said, "Maybe he wants to work the ranch." She said, "Maybe, but he should get to choose." I thought about Carl Westover, who had wanted to be me, and wondered what he had actually wanted to be before that. One evening after supper, when the others had gone off and we were the last 2 at the table with the lamp between us, she asked me a question. She said, What do you actually want to do? I said, right now. She said, no, not right now, generally. I didn't have an answer. I sat there with the lamp between us, and I realized I did not have an answer, not even a bad one, not even a wrong one, because I had not thought about that question in 20 years. What I wanted had stopped mattering around the time the legend started. You don't ask what the mountain wants. The mountain just is. I said, I don't know. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, that's the most honest thing I've heard you say. I looked at her. She said, you're very careful about what you say. You give the answer that fits the story about you. I've been watching. I said, what story is that? She said, the one where you're not afraid of anything and everything you've done was a choice. The lamp made a sound, wind against the window, somewhere outside a horse. I said, how long have you been teaching? She said, 7 years. I said, good at it. She said, yes. I said, you just say that. No, I think so, no apology. She said, I know what I'm good at. Most people do, they just don't say it. I looked at her across the lamp. Red hair lit gold on one side, steady eyes, the look of someone who has thought about most things and made peace with what she found. I said, I used to be good at staying alive. She said, used to be. I said, I'm less sure of it lately. She looked at me a long time, then she said, I don't think that's what you're actually afraid of. I didn't ask her what she meant. I knew what she meant. On the 9th day, Haverford came. I saw him riding in from the window of my room, 3 men, him in the lead, which was not how I'd imagined it because Haverford had always seemed like the kind of man who sent other people. But here he was in person. He was a thick man in his 50s with a gray beard and the look of someone who has been made to feel small more often than he liked, and who has responded to that by making himself dangerous. I stood at the window and watched them come and felt the familiar thing move through me. The narrowing. The cold calculation that runs all the way back to 23 years old walking into a Abilene freight office, not caring what happened next. Except this time I cared. That was different. I went downstairs. Rosalind Keel was in the front room with a book, and she looked up when I came down, and she saw it in my face, and she stood. She said, Haverford. I said yes. She said, how many? I said 3. She looked at me a moment. Then she said, I'm coming with you. I said, you're not. She said, you have a concussion and 3 men against you. I'm coming with you. I said, what are you going to do? She said, I don't know yet. I'll decide when I get there. She set down the book and straightened up and looked at me with an expression that was not quite argument but was not yielding. And I understood in that moment that this woman had been walking into hard things her whole life and was not going to stop now because I told her to, and that the arguing would cost me more than accepting would. I said, stay on the porch. If it goes wrong, you go back inside and you lock the door. She said, agreed. We went out. It is not a heroic story, what happened. Haverford was in the street. His men flanked him. People had cleared the way people do. Suddenly there were no people where there had been people. The sky was flat white winter, clouds piled up over the plains, a wind with ice in it. The kind of light where everything is too bright and has no shadow. Haverford said some things, the things men say in those situations about debts and reckonings, and I let him say them because talking is time and time is good. I kept my eyes on the 2 men, the angles, the hands. Then Haverford moved. And here is what I will tell you. I drew and I was fast. I was always fast, that much of the legend was true. I got 1 shot off before the man on the left drew, and that shot hit Haverford's shoulder and spun him and spoiled his aim, and his shot went into the porch post above my head. And then a rifle cracked. 1, 2, close together, so close the echo tangled. The man on the left went down. The man on the right had dropped his gun and had his hands up. And from the porch of the Alameda Hotel, Rosalind Keel lowered Mrs. Parr's Winchester and breathed out and held still. The world held still a moment. Haverford was on the ground, shot through the shoulder, alive. The man on the right had his hands up and his face white. The man on the left was alive too, I realized. She'd shot him in the arm, not the chest. She'd placed them both on purpose. I looked at her. She was looking at Haverford. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her face was set and certain, the face of someone doing a thing they have decided to do, not panicking into. Later, I would find out that she'd grown up with brothers on a farm in Ohio, and that she'd been shooting since she was 10 years old, and that she was a better shot than most people in that county, and that she had decided while we were in the street that if it went wrong, she was not going to stand on the porch and watch. Later, right then, I just looked at her. And she looked at me and said, "Are you hit?" The sheriff came. Haverford was taken into custody. His man with the raised hands confirmed the testimony that it was Haverford who drew first. The one I'd shot on the riverbank, who was still in town with his bandaged leg, added his own testimony with the peculiar cooperative spirit of a man who wants very badly to go home. By evening it was settled, legally speaking. I sat in Mrs. Parr's front room while Mrs. Parr, who had lent her rifle and never said a word about it, served coffee and said she hoped the commotion hadn't bothered the other boarders. The surveyor and the hide buyer were not there. They were, according to Mrs. Parr, somewhere commemorating having witnessed something that would make a good story. Rosalind Keel sat across from me. She had set down the rifle, and she had not been shaking then, and she was not shaking now, and I was watching her carefully for it because I had seen people fall apart after moments like that, the body deciding to feel what the mind had set aside. But she was still. She was holding her coffee cup in both hands and looking at the fire, and she was still. I said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "I know." I said, "That was a dangerous thing." She said, "Yes." I said, "Why did you?" She was quiet a moment. The fire made sounds. Then she said, "Because you were in trouble and I could help." I said, "It's not your trouble." She said, "It was when I decided it was." I looked at her. The firelight was warm on her face. She turned and met my eyes, and there was no drama in it, no grand speech. Just a woman looking at a man from across a fire, steady as she'd been all along. I said, "I would have managed." She said, "Maybe, probably not as well." A pause, then, "You've been managing alone a long time." I said, "I have." She said, "Does it work?" I looked at the fire. The light moved. I thought about 20 years of it, the rooms full of strangers watching, the names of things I'd done that were not quite the things I'd done, the boy who wanted to be me, the horse I mourned more than people, the question she'd asked across the supper table, "What do you actually want?" and my having no answer. I said, "No." She said, "No," not a question, just repeating it. Then she said, "I didn't think so." We were quiet a little while. The fire crackled. The wind moved against the windows. Then she said quietly, "I'm staying in Tascosa through spring. The contract runs through May." I said, "I know." She said, "After that, I don't know." I said, "Neither do I." She nodded once, as if we had agreed to something. Maybe we had. I need to tell you about a morning about 3 weeks after that. I had not left. I was aware that I had not left. I had stopped making up reasons why I hadn't left, which was itself a kind of honesty. I was helping split wood. Not for any particular reason. Mrs. Parr had said something at breakfast about needing the woodpile built up before the next cold snap, and I had gotten up from the table and gone out and started splitting wood, which is not the kind of thing a legend does in a dime novel, but which is the kind of thing a man does who is in a boarding house in Tascosa in January and wants to be useful. I had been at it maybe an hour when Rosalind came out with coffee and set a cup on the fence post near me and didn't go back in right away. She stood and watched me work for a minute, which I noticed and said nothing about, and then she said something that I have not stopped thinking about since. She said, "You know what you look like right now." I split a log. Said, "What?" She said, "Like yourself." I set them all down and looked at her. She was leaning on the fence with the cold morning all around her, the plains flat and frost-bright behind her, her coat buttoned to the throat, and she was looking at me with that look she had, the reading look, the one that was taking something in. She said, "When you're in the saloon or when somebody's looking at you, you're doing the—" She made a gesture with her hand I can't quite describe, something about how a man holds himself when he's being observed. "You know what I mean." I said, "I know what you mean." She said, "But right now you're just splitting wood." I picked up the coffee. It was hot and good. I drank it and looked out at the flat winter light. I said, "My wife used to—" I stopped, started again. I was a different man when Candelita was alive. I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know what I was until she was gone and I couldn't find it anymore. She didn't say anything, didn't hurry me. I said somebody needed to know who you actually were, and when she died, nobody did, and after a while I stopped knowing too. The wind moved, far off a crow, the plains that go on and on. She said, I know who you are. I looked at her. She said, not the story. I've been watching for 3 weeks. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, without apology or drama. You're funny when you think nobody's listening. You get up early and you sit on the porch with your coffee before anyone's awake. You don't like sweet things and you pretend not to mind them. You miss that horse you told me about more than you miss most people, and you're embarrassed about that for no reason. She paused. You're a good man who has been inside a story about himself for so long he can't remember the difference. I stood very still. She said, I see the difference. The frost burned off the fence rail in the sun. The coffee cup was warm in my hand. Somewhere in the street, someone was calling to someone, the ordinary sounds of a morning. I said, Rosalind. She said, yes. I said, I don't know what I'd do with a quiet life. She said, I imagine you'd figure it out. I said, I'm not easy to be around. Ask anybody. She said, I'm not asking anybody. I'm telling you what I see. She straightened up off the fence and picked up the empty cup I'd set down. And what I see is worth staying around for. She went inside. I stood at the woodpile in the cold white morning and I put my hands on the maul handle and I breathed. In and out, the plain sound of breathing. 41 years old. A man who had been a legend so long he'd forgotten he was a man. And a woman who looked at him across a fence rail and said, I see you. Not the story, you. The spring came slow to the panhandle, grudging, as if it had other places it would rather be. The frost came and went 3 times after you thought it was done. The river ran high with snowmelt and then low. The plains went from brown to a green so tentative you had to look twice to believe it. I was still there. I had written letters. Several letters to several places concerning certain practical matters, warrants that could be addressed, situations that could be resolved with money and a good lawyer and enough time. And I had discovered that I had enough of all 3 if I was willing to sit still long enough to apply them. A man named Jerome Aldridge in Santa Fe, who understood these arrangements, had written back to say that 3 territories were manageable, and one was a matter of some creativity, and that he would need 6 months. I wrote back and said I could wait. I had not had a name for what I was doing until I admitted to myself what I was doing, which was building a life somewhere. Slowly, carefully. Not because I knew how, I didn't know how, but because there was a woman here who had looked at me and seen a man worth staying around, and I was not willing to ride away from that. I did things in Tascosa, helped a rancher named Bowman move cattle when he was short-handed and paid me fair for it, which I respected. Fixed the fence on the north side of the Alameda Hotel because it needed fixing and there was nobody else. Went with the doctor one afternoon to a ranch 15 miles out where a boy had come off a horse and needed the arm set, and held the boy still while the doctor worked, and told the boy a story to keep his mind off the pain, a story that was not about me, a story I made up on the spot about a man and his horse, and the way the desert looked at sunrise. The boy said when it was done, "Is that a true story?" I said, "True enough." We rode back in the late afternoon light, the doctor and I, and he said, "You're not what I expected." I said, "What did you expect?" He said, "Less ordinary." I said, "Everybody's ordinary up close." He considered that. He was a careful man, the doctor, the kind who thought before he spoke. He said, "Maybe, but not everybody makes a kid forget his arms being set." I thought about that the rest of the way back. There was an evening in April that I keep coming back to. The school term was winding down. Rosalind had been talking about the end of it, about what came after. Her contract in Tascosa was done in May, and there was another school in a town called Canadian that had written to offer her a position for the following year. She hadn't decided. We had talked around it without talking about it, in the way you do when a thing is important enough to break if you look at it wrong. We were walking along the river after supper, which we did sometimes when the evening was fair. The Canadian River in April when the light is going. It's a flat, grassy river, not dramatic, not the kind of river you'd paint. but it has a sound to it in the evening that is quiet and continuous and that I had come to like. She was talking about the boy she'd been worried about, the bright one whose father wanted him on the ranch. She said she'd arranged for a correspondence with a teacher in Amarillo who was willing to send books, and that the boy's father had, after a long conversation that she described as stubborn on both sides, agreed to allow it. I said, "You didn't give up on him." She said, "I don't give up on people who are worth the effort." I said, "How do you know which ones those are?" She said, "Practice." I looked at the river, said, "The position in Canadian." She said, "Yes." I said, "Is it good?" She said, "Better pay, bigger school." A pause, "Farther from here." I said, "I know where Canadian is." She said, "I know you know." We walked. The light was going orange over the plain to the west, that specific panhandle sunset that is too large and too slow, and makes you feel small in a way that isn't entirely bad. I said, "I talked to Aldridge, the lawyer." She said, "I know, you told me." I said, "He thinks another 4 months, then the worst of it is clear." She said, 4 months. I said, "Yes." She was quiet a moment. We stopped walking. She was looking at the river. I said, "I'm trying to say something." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm not. I don't know how to say it without it sounding like something out of a dime novel." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, said, "Try anyway." I looked at her, the river sound, the sunset, her face in the last of that light, patient, turned to me, waiting. I said, "I was nobody for 20 years, and then I was everybody's story for 20 more, and I don't know the difference between those things anymore, and I'm not sure I ever will. But I know that I came to this town and you looked at me and saw something that wasn't either of those things. And I stopped, started again. I would like to keep being that, whatever that is, the thing you see when you look at me. I would like to keep being that." She was quiet a long time, long enough that I started to think I'd said it wrong. Then she turned to me and she put her hand on my chest, flat over my heart, and she looked up at me in the last of the April light with that reading look, the one that saw through the story to the man, and she said, "You've been that the whole time. You just couldn't see it from inside." I put my hand over hers. The river moved. The plain went dark gold and then just dark, some bird crossing the sky that I didn't know the name of. She took the position in Canadian. We talked about it and the talking was honest, and I told her to take it and meant it, because the thing she did, the teaching, the looking at a 12-year-old boy and seeing what he could be, that was not a small thing, and I was not going to ask her to set it down for my comfort. She thanked me for saying it, which I didn't quite understand until she told me that the last man who'd wanted to marry her had expected her to stop working when she did. I said, "That would be like asking you to stop breathing." She said, "That's what I told him." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said I had an inflated sense of my own importance." I said some things about that man that I won't repeat here because they are not charitable, and I don't regret them. She laughed, really laughed, not a polite version of it, and I sat with the sound of that like a man sitting in sun after a long winter. Canadian was 60 miles, not far. I went when I could. She came to Tascosa for the holidays, and Mrs. Parr fed us both and pretended not to notice that things had shifted, which was very kind of her since everyone in town had noticed. Aldridge wrote in September that 2 territories were clear, and the 3rd was likely to resolve quietly, and that I should stop writing under an assumed name, which I did with a feeling I couldn't quite name. Like setting down something heavy you'd been carrying long enough you'd forgotten it was in your hands. We were married in November of 1879, in Canadian, in a church that was so new the paint was still not fully dry. The minister's daughter played the organ. Rosalind wore a dark green dress that I will not attempt to describe because words are wrong for it. The schoolchildren she'd been teaching all year were in the front pews, cleaned up and largely still, except for the bright boy, the 12-year-old, who had grown 3 inches since September and who cried without embarrassment, and did not seem to mind that anyone saw. After the ceremony, outside in the November cold, that boy came up to me and shook my hand with the particular seriousness of a boy who wants to be treated like a man, and he said, "Are you going to stay here?" I said, "I'm going to try." He considered that. Then he said, "Miss Keel says you used to be famous." I said, "I used to be a story somebody told." He said, "What are you now?" I looked over at Rosalind, who was talking with her students, who had her hand on one of the girl's shoulders, who was laughing at something the girl had said, who was completely and entirely herself in the way she always was, in the way I had spent 40 years not knowing I needed. I said, "I'm working on it." The boy nodded like that was a satisfactory answer. Maybe it was. There is a photograph. She had it made in Amarillo when we passed through in the spring of 1880, heading west to look at some land we'd heard about in New Mexico, a piece with water and grass and room for something to grow. The photographer was a young man, serious about his work, who arranged us 3 times before he was satisfied. In the photograph, Rosalind is standing and I am beside her, and she has her hand through my arm, and she is looking at the camera the way she always looked at things, direct, certain, a woman who knew her own mind. And I am looking at the camera too, but my face. I've looked at that photograph 100 times since, and I still can't say exactly what's in my face. I wasn't aware of making any particular expression. I was just standing there beside her in a photography studio in Amarillo with her hand through my arm and the afternoon light coming through the window. But it's not the face from the dime novels. It's not the story. It's just a man. A man who got found by a woman who knew what she was looking at. We got the land. New Mexico territory, west of Las Vegas, up toward the mountains where the grass grows deep and the water is good. The kind of land that doesn't give itself up easily, but that, once it's yours and you understand it, will keep you a long time. I worked it. I was not good at it at first. I knew cattle well enough, had been around them all my life, but the particular daily work of it, the maintenance and patience of building something piece by piece, that was new, and I made mistakes, and there were seasons that were hard in ways I hadn't prepared for. But I learned. That was the thing I hadn't expected. I could still learn. 42, 43 years old, and I was still capable of not knowing something and then knowing it. It sounds small. It wasn't small to me. Rosalind taught in Las Vegas until we had enough going on the ranch that she didn't need to. And then she taught anyway, 2 days a week, because she was never going to stop being what she was. We had a room full of books that she had collected over years of moving, the spines all worn from use, and some evenings she would read to me and some evenings I would just listen to her read without saying that's what I was doing. We had a daughter. We called her Alina for Candelita's mother, who had shown me a kindness once when I needed it and who deserved to be remembered. Alina came out into the world with her mother's eyes, which are the eyes that see things clearly and wait for what they're looking for and do not flinch when they find it. I looked at her the first time, this small and certain creature wrapped in a blanket in Rosalind's arms, and I did not have words for what that was. Still don't. I'm an old man now. Not ancient, old enough. The territory is different. The territory is a state now, has been for years, and Tascosa has mostly blown away in the wind the way some places do, and the dime novels have gone out of fashion. Boys don't want cowboys anymore, they want something else, something I don't quite follow. My name still means something to some people. There are men who knew the story, who come out to the ranch sometimes to look at me, who want me to be what the story said I was. I'm polite about it. I don't have the heart to tell them the story was mostly wrong and that I was glad to outlive it. What I am is this: a man on a piece of land in New Mexico with a woman I don't deserve, and a daughter who is going to outlast us both, and a life that is quieter than anything I expected and better than anything I earned. What I was, a legend nobody really knew, a story that moved faster than the truth, a man inside a performance so long he had nearly disappeared inside it. What found me? A woman in a boarding house in Tascosa, Texas, who looked at me across a supper table with steady eyes and who saw the man under the story, who chose him anyway, who stood on a porch with a rifle when she didn't have to, who put her hand on my chest and said, "You've been that the whole time." I go out early, before the house wakes, before the hands are up in the thin light, before the sun clears the mountains. I go out with my coffee and I stand and look at the land, the way it runs west toward those mountains, the colors it turns in the early light, not the red and orange of the novels, not dramatic, just the quiet gray and blue and then gold of a morning that is only doing what mornings do. Sometimes she finds me out there. She comes out with her own coffee and she stands beside me and we look at it together and we don't always say anything. There's a particular silence we have, Rosalind and I, that is different from every other silence I have known. It's not empty. It's the silence of two people who have said most of the important things and don't need to keep saying them, who can just stand in the morning and let it be what it is. She puts her hand in my arm, the way she did in the photograph, the way she always does. She looks at the mountains. I look at her. That's the story. A man who was a legend for 20 years and a ghost inside it. A woman who looked at him and saw the man. A rifle shot on a porch in Tascosa that nobody expected. A life built on a piece of land in New Mexico, piece by piece, the way you do. I told you I wasn't easy to be around. She never argued with that. She just stayed, made her choice and kept making it every morning, every year. And I have tried to be every morning, every year, the man she saw when she looked at me that first time across a boarding house supper table in the panhandle of Texas. Some mornings I think I get there. That's enough, that's plenty. That's everything.